After a long stint of working office jobs, I sought something more in touch with nature. My search took me farther and farther until I came across an advertisement for a job as a fire lookout. The pay was low, the hours were horrendous, and the benefits were minimal. However, the lifestyle it offered was something I desired, even if it was just for a temporary reprieve from my dull city life. I never expected to end up working this job for the better part of a decade. But over my time, I collected more than enough stories to hold any party's attention for an entire week. That's because my job wasn't just that of an ordinary fire watcher. I don't know if this is the case for others in the same line of work as me, or if it was unique to my situation, but let's just say we had more responsibilities than simply watching for smoke. My first day on the job, there was a lot to take in. Instead of being shown around by another lookout, I was led by the area's ranger. Apparently, the previous 2 lookouts had quit on short notice, and since there was no one else to train their replacements, the duty fell on his shoulders. The walk to the fire tower was tough at first. If it weren't for my partner leading the way, I would have gotten lost many times over. Just when you think you are at a clearing that should lead straight to the tower, we would take a sharp turn that seemed to lead away from the destination. Yet, it turned out to be the right way. We arrived at the tower around 8:20 p.m. The first thing I was told was that the door needed to be closed before 8:30 p.m., and should not be opened until the shift ended at 6 a.m., not accounting for daylight savings. Once we were safely inside, I was briefly left alone while my partner went out with a brush and paint can, returning with a few red specks on him. The door was locked, and my first shift officially began. At first, things were uneventful. I expected to be lectured and taught all I needed to do, but once the door closed, my partner simply went to lounge around. Left to my own devices, I familiarized myself with the place where I would spend the next 10 hours. There were 4 rooms in total, a kitchen with minimal rustic appliances, a bathroom with bare essentials, a lounging area with basic wooden furniture, and a small storage area filled with things I didn't know how to use. All rooms had clear glass and doors leading to the balcony for easy access to the breathtaking view. I tried starting a conversation, but my partner wasn't interested. Any questions about the job were shut down. Hours passed, and the thick night settled in. My partner checked his watch, took something out of storage, and handed me a pair of binoculars. They looked much more high-tech than I had expected. When I turned them on, the view was extraordinary. Despite the overbearing darkness outside, I could clearly see for miles. Whether there was night vision or infrared technology, I didn't know, but I was able to observe a vast area. I spent the next while scanning the horizon for signs of smoke or light. After a while of no activity, I turned my attention to the surrounding tree line closer to the tower. I froze when I noticed a figure barely distinguishable from the trees. The only reason I spotted it was because of its consistent, repetitive movement. I focused the binoculars on it, and what I saw made me uneasy. It looked like a person, waving enthusiastically. I waited to see if there were more, but it didn't stop. It continued, wave after wave, for what felt like an eternity. It became increasingly uncomfortable, and even after several minutes, it didn't cease. I continued to check through the binoculars through the night, and sure enough, there they were, waving in my direction. When I asked my partner about it, he just grunted and told me to ignore it. Seeing that he wouldn't be of any help, I resigned myself to occasionally checking on them. That was my first shift, and it set the tone for the rest of my career as a fire lookout. I mentioned the dingy kitchen earlier, so let me go into more detail. It was a simple room, in line with the rustic wooden theme of the tower. There was a small fridge with a limited selection of food. The options were either a lettuce sandwich or a salad consisting of lettuce, cherry tomatoes, and bread, though the sandwich was mostly just lettuce. On the plus side, there were condiments to make the food more tolerable, brandless packets of ketchup. For drinks, there was only bottled water, and for snacks, lightly salted crackers. To say their hospitality was lacking would be an understatement. At first, I politely made do with what was provided, masking my dismay as much as possible. But after a few weeks, I realized that I no longer needed to maintain that friendly facade and decided to bring my own packed meal. The shift started as usual. The ranger left with his can of paint and returned with red specks dotting his arm. I was left to my own devices again, trying to observe peculiarities. However, during this shift, things were slightly more intense. There were more figures spotted at various distances, all waving enthusiastically in my direction. The most unsettling part was that they were closer than usual. Their wide, gleaming white smiles became evident in the dim light. I had enough of their antics and decided to sit down and enjoy my packed meal. But as I opened the box, my partner dropped what he was doing and snatched it away from me. Figuring he was starving for something that wasn't just water and bread, I yelled at him to leave some bread behind. But instead, he ran to the balcony door, opened the box, and tossed everything off the edge. He came back furious, holding the now empty lunchbox, and yelled at me for bringing outside food. I hesitantly pointed out that no one had told me about that rule. He went through a range of emotions, from studying me to thinking over his memory, and then, defeated, told me not to do it again. He also informed me that I was no longer allowed outside for the rest of the night, and locked all the balcony doors. I figured he had done this because the balcony was my favorite part of the job, soaking in the night air and observing nature at night. But as the night went on, I realized there was another reason for his actions. It started with small thuds, heavy, soft bumps that seemed to shake the ground outside. Most of it sounded like it was hitting dirt, but occasionally, I heard the distinct sound of something hitting the wooden beams that supported the tower. It was hard to see anything from the angle of the windows, but using the binoculars, I saw movement just below the tower. I never managed to make out what was lurking outside, but the sounds were troubling. We were so high up that you could barely hear an elephant thundering outside, so whatever was outside was hitting the ground with tremendous force. When the shift ended and we finally ventured outside, I saw the remnants of my food scattered across the ground. Crumbs and wrappers were strewn about, some of it fallen into the large divots now punched into the dirt. Without getting too specific about the location, I can tell you that the area we were stationed in barely gets any visitors. This is fortunate for public safety. But when someone does appear, it's always difficult to know what to do. On my way back to the tower, I spotted a group of young people, 4 of them, looking like they were planning to spend the night in the woods. At this point, I wasn't trained in handling such situations, but I felt a moral obligation to try to talk them out of it. I called out to them and tried my best to warn them, but without giving away any specifics. They listened at first, but one of the bolder ones asked if I was a ranger. When I admitted I wasn't, I could see that all my credibility vanished, and they left with a hollow agreement to stay safe. I made it to my shift in time and saw the ranger returning with his tin of paint, red specks dotting his right arm. We launched into our usual tasks, but I couldn't shake the thought of the hikers from my mind. I wrestled with the idea of bringing it up to him, but I knew most of the things I asked were met with dismissal. Eventually, I gathered the courage and asked him what we should do if we saw hikers entering at night. He paused from his reading, his eyes no longer focused on the book. After a moment of silence, he finally asked how many. I told him 4. He then went back to reading, and the conversation ended there. That shift turned out to be uneventful, and I spent the rest of it watching the trees for any nocturnal animals until the first light of dawn. I followed him as we walked around the common entrance near the tree line, where most people typically parked before venturing further. Once there, I felt a tight grip on my shoulder and realized the ranger was holding me firmly. His other hand was placed over his eyes. Hesitantly, I asked him what he was doing, and he simply told me to follow his orders. He explained that when I saw those same hikers, I was to tell him immediately. So we waited. We sat from 6 in the morning until around 9, waiting for any sign of movement. I sat uncomfortably, while the ranger never let go of my shoulder or moved his hand from his eyes. Whatever he was doing, he was completely committed to it. Eventually, movement emerged from the tree line. The group had returned to their car, smiles plastered on their faces. Whatever they had been up to the night before, it seemed like they had a lot of fun. I muttered to the ranger that they were here, and his grip tightened as he braced himself for whatever he was about to do. I watched as they packed their gear into the truck, moving in a very jovial, almost exaggerated manner. I wondered if they were high. "How many are there?" the ranger asked. "5, same as last night," I replied. "5, not 4. He probed further. "Yeah, they don't seem shaken up at all," I shot back. "In fact, they seem really happy. They look like they had a good time." He sighed and asked me to read out the license plate number. He then called into his radio, adding, "Code 147. I didn't realize what had happened until the ranger recounted the events of the previous night. He adamantly stated that I originally told him there were 4 hikers. I recalled the events, and while I knew I had told him 5, he insisted on his version of the story. "Let me tell you about Dave." No, that isn't the ranger's name, but I never did get his real name. It's something that bothered me at the time, but in retrospect, I realized it was probably a wise choice. It didn't take long for me to become a seasoned veteran of the job. That's not to say it was difficult, especially given how few responsibilities I had at first. One day, we met at our usual time, and the ranger went about his duties with the red paint. I set up my schedule for the shift, spacing out my watch times with frequent small breaks for side projects, reading, and browsing my phone. Shifts were more bearable when I had something to look forward to after my long hours of vigilantly watching the tree line. I was so fixated on a movement in the far brush, possibly my first sighting of a deer, that I was startled when I heard something eerily close. It wasn't the usual sounds of twigs breaking or dirt being disturbed, but rather a polite, simple, "Hello?" After quickly settling down, I looked to the ground where a person stood, barely illuminated by the tower's light. I was so dumbfounded that I didn't immediately respond, prompting a second elongated, "Hello?" Snapping back to reality, I replied with a pleasantry. "I'm terribly sorry, I seem to have lost my bearings. I was trying to head back to my car, but I keep looping around. Could you help me find my way down?" He spoke in the most polite tone I'd ever heard, with a light note to his voice and a constant, brimming smile. I smiled back and engaged in conversation. After a few exchanges, I learned that he often walked the lovely trails in this area. He even offered to show me some scenic spots around the land. This piqued my interest, as I was eager to learn more about the area and really get in touch with the beauty of the land. All I had to do was step outside and help him find his way. I told him I'd be right down and went back inside, but the closer I got to the door, the slower I moved. All I could think about was how I was told never to open the door. Was that simply to ensure I didn't leave during my shift, or was there another reason? Under any other circumstance, I would have taken my own initiative, something I had prided myself on when I first applied for the job. But with all that I had seen so far, I found myself second-guessing everything. My body mimicked my thoughts, leaning toward the stairwell, and then pulling back toward the ranger. After a few back-and-forth moments, the ranger took notice and, with a confused look, asked me what I was doing. I stared at him as he gave me a curious look, as if he were a father looking down at his confused child. I mulled things over, but eventually cracked and told him everything I had seen. He just stared at me in silence. Finally, he sighed, got up, grabbed some ornaments off the table, and went to the balcony. He started hurling the ornaments off the edge, all while shouting expletives mixed in with demands for the person to go away. I didn't move. I was stunned by his actions. Eventually, the ranger returned, sat back down, and resumed reading his magazine as if nothing had happened. I knew I wouldn't get a word out of him, so I just went back to my watch. I don't think I've mentioned the dancers yet. One valuable lesson I learned quickly was to never play music too loudly, especially around a time when I was being left alone more often. Since reading was never my thing, I tried getting creative with what little I could carry to my shift. Because the connection in the area was spotty at best, I had to resort to a more analog approach. One day, I spotted a vintage-looking CD player at a second-hand store, almost for free. The guy at the store had a look of shock on his face, as if he couldn't believe someone was excited about such an item. I could tell he was worried I'd somehow stumbled upon a forgotten gem and was about to scalp it for a price he had missed. But I was just glad to have found something useful. You'd be surprised how cheap you can get CDs in a charity shop, and you'd be amazed at some of the gems you can find: old Backstreet Boys albums, original Green Day records. Before long, I was jamming out to Avril Lavigne, singing the words I had sung 1,000 times before. It wasn't long before I was completely engrossed in the music when I noticed a flicker of movement that caught my eye. At first, I thought it might be some lost travelers looking for help. That didn't seem to be in my job description, so I quickly turned down the music and cautiously looked around for any signs of life. But it quickly fell quiet again. I went back to my activities, hoping the night would pass uneventfully. Sadly, that wish would never be realized. It soon became a game of cat and mouse. I would catch sight of something, inspect it, and find nothing there. It was jarring because each time I fiddled with the CD player, which wasn't in the most stable condition, causing the CDs to skip whenever I knocked it, my patience wore thin. Finally, I stormed out to the balcony without turning down the music to see what was happening. Across the edges of the tree line, I saw scores of figures, a legion of strange, emaciated creatures. It was hard to make out any details because they moved so much, swaying and jerking in a rhythmic pace. Their approach was slow, but their movements were quick, showing that they held some power behind their swings. No movement was synchronized. Each figure moved at its own pace, but the one thing that was the same was the beat at which they acted. Very quickly, I realized that their movements were in sync with the exact BPM of the song playing. In a panic, I quickly slapped the player off and rushed back to the edge. As I watched, the creatures slowly stopped and began shuffling back toward the tree line. After that, I turned off the player for the rest of the night. A few days later, I came in for a shift I couldn't cover, only to find that my CD player had been smashed. The fact that it wasn't disposed of told me that it was a message, one that I wasn't supposed to play music anymore. I learned a valuable lesson when the lights went out. It was a quiet evening, like most others when the ranger was managing me for the night. I had learned to enjoy reading, despite it not being my favorite pastime, and it looked like it would be another uneventful night. In the station, we had minimal lighting, a few small lamps and a pendant light. This made reading more of an ordeal than it should have been. It was a mystery how the ranger kept his composure under these conditions, but I soon realized something was off when the lights suddenly went out. The room fell into total darkness. I looked at the lamps. They were still on. I checked the pendant light. It was still brightly lit. I glanced at my manager, and for the first time, I saw emotion on his face. He was staring out toward the balcony, his eyes bulging. That was the most emotion I had ever seen from him. I followed his gaze and, at first, couldn't figure out what was wrong. The sky was dark, and I couldn't see anything lurking in the woods, something I usually kept an eye on. As I looked around, I realized I couldn't see anything at all. The more I stared into the darkness, I realized there was no moon, no stars. It was as if everything had been consumed by the night. My manager quickly got up, moving around the rooms, turning off each light. I barely managed to whisper, about to ask what was happening, but he quickly shushed me. There, we sat in total silence and total darkness for about an hour. Though it was only an hour, it felt much longer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was coming. When the light began to return from outside, the oppressive air lifted. We turned the lights back on and resumed as if nothing had happened. It wasn't until later that I learned the consequences of doing things wrong. Dave found a wife. Every so often, I would see some hikers graze the outskirts of the zone I patrolled, a woman and a child. During the brief times we spoke, she would talk about how this was her way of bonding with her son now that she was a single mother. Sadly, her husband had passed away a while back, and for some time, she had lost the deep connection with her son that she felt mothers should have. It was rare, but when we bumped into each other, we would always swap pleasantries and share tips on navigating the woods. Though most of mine were warnings about the many areas in my zone. I learned her name was Lisa, and her son was Joe. Sadly, I made the mistake of telling her my name. Now I understand why the ranger never told me his, perhaps for the sake of brevity, or maybe just to avoid making the same mistake. For now, I'll refer to him as Jerry. It was nighttime during one of my shifts when I heard a voice calling out to me. A familiar voice. It was Dave. In his usual manner, he told me he had something important to show me. Despite knowing I shouldn't engage, I called back. "Go away, Dave, I'm not interested," I yelled, having learned from our many previous encounters. "You don't understand, the most amazing thing has happened. I'm in love," he shot back, a vibrancy to his tone that piqued my interest. Usually, his schemes involved trying to lure me outside. "Oh, I hurt my leg. Help me, there's a bear. I lost my glasses, I can't see." But this time, it was different. He wasn't enticing me outside. This was something I could do from the balcony. It was new. I made my way over, mostly confident that I'd be safe. It turns out I would be, but what I saw made my heart sink. Dave was standing there with Lisa and Joe, both with large smiles stretched across their faces. But their eyes didn't seem happy. Dave, however, had a genuine smile on his face. He had what he wanted. "Calm down," he said. "I want you to meet my new family. They're excited to meet you." "I'm not interested," I replied bluntly, though I was hiding the pain I felt. Just when I thought I'd have my usual back and forth with Dave, Lisa spoke up. "Calm down, Jerry. We want you to come to our ceremony," she said, her voice full of emotion. My heart broke. "I can't," I weakly responded, though the apology I gave held multiple layers. I was sorry they got caught up in this. I was sorry I hadn't done more to prevent it. I was sorry that I couldn't do anything. All I could do was guess that they must have stayed out here past daytime, and of all the things in this zone, they were found by Dave first. Now, every so often when I'm on a shift by myself, I hear them calling to me. There's a certain power they have now, the power of my name. Even though I know I shouldn't go out, the allure is much stronger when they address me on such a personal level. I just hope they don't catch me in a moment of weakness, or I might become a new member of this growing family. A lesson I was never told but learned by watching was to memorize the entire layout of the watchtower at the start of each shift. One night, I was with the ranger on another one of our many quiet shifts. I had gotten into the habit of drinking tea throughout the night. It provided a gentle amount of caffeine and had many health benefits, if you believe the homeopathic articles. I was about to grab a fresh tea bag out of the cupboard when I noticed something next to the kettle. "Is this yours?" I asked, reaching for it. My eyes studied it as I extended my hand. It was an old doll, looking Victorian in design. Its face was ivory porcelain, slightly cracked in places. Its rosy cheeks were delicately dabbed on, and its eyes were glassy blue. I've never had an irrational fear of dolls, and in a way, I thought it was cute. But my thoughts were ripped from me by the sudden tearing of muscle in my leg. I fell, turning to look at the ranger, who was staring at me with wide eyes, a pistol in his hands. Throughout my time with him, I had seen him witness many disturbing things. We had watched the palmless squash the carcass of a deer to the point that it looked more two-dimensional than three. I had seen him make decisions, choosing between two identical hikers, one to kill and one to let go, never knowing if the choice was the right one. I had seen him read books of many genres, cleaning a comedy without so much as a smirk, and reading a detective mystery without even raising an eyebrow. But the man standing there now wore the most grim expression I had ever seen. When I snapped out of my shock, I screamed in agony. He quickly came over, helped stem the bleeding, and seated me on the couch. Upon inspection, I realized my leg was unscathed, though I'll never know if that was intentional or just luck. I had to use an ancient-looking crutch to move about for the rest of the night, and the night dragged on to become one of the most stressful shifts of my life. You see, when I returned to the kitchen area, the doll was nowhere to be found. The only explanation I got from the ranger was that one touch was all it took. He didn't elaborate further, but the urgency in his voice sent chills down my spine. The rest of the night became a game of cat and mouse. We sat together in tense silence. The ranger returned to his reading, but after every finished page, he'd glance up and look around, becoming much more cautious. I sat there, trying to keep my wits together, gently sipping the tea I had finally finished making. Eventually, I reached down for another sip, but just as the ranger finished a page and glanced up, he threw the book down and drew his pistol on me. I froze, not wanting to be shot again, my eyes wide. We stared at each other until I realized that although I was looking at him, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at where I was reaching. Without making any sudden movements, I craned my neck to where my hand was reaching, and there it was, the doll, just a breath away from my fingers, its mousy red hair close enough to touch. This continued for the rest of the night. My coworker, the ranger, went to the bathroom, and while in there, I heard him yell. I couldn't rush over to help due to my leg. All I could do was surmise that the doll must have been waiting in a precarious position and had almost caught him. When the sun finally peeked over the horizon, the ranger sighed with relief. This must have meant it was over. He empathically helped me all the way to the hospital to get my leg properly treated. It was the closest we had been since starting together. I think this was the point at which he knew I would last longer than the previous applicants. You would think that our job as fire watch lookouts was just to look out for fires. There was one time, however, when I saw a fire. The ranger was sitting with me, and by this point, we were reading the same book together. We would each get a copy, read it, and then move on. When he first suggested this, I thought we would discuss it afterward. But he didn't seem to understand that, even though this was bizarre to me, I kept up with it, figuring it was his way of bonding with people. Something you learn quickly when reading is to notice any changes in light. It's how the ranger had picked up on the darkness when the stars went out. But this time, it was the opposite. At first, I noticed a faint orange glow from far in the tree line. I tried pointing it out to the ranger, but he just glanced at it, hummed, and went back to reading. I tried to do the same, trusting his judgment, and trying to keep up with his incredible reading pace. However, the longer I read, the bigger the glow became. Eventually, I recognized it for what it was, fire. It was bright enough now that the billows of smoke were visible. It was a torrent of flames, and it was growing rapidly. I tried pointing this out to the ranger, but he just kept reading. I sat there, unable to focus on the reading as I worried about the growing inferno. Then I heard a voice. "Help! Fire! Please help! My family is in there!" I ran over to the edge of the balcony. It was Dave. His usual smirk was gone, replaced with genuine panic. "How do I know you're not lying?" I hesitated, my voice low. "Lying? You can see it. Look." He pointed to the edges of the tree line. I could see the hauntings of the fire growing ever closer. The woods, the dancers, the palmless, the minifigure man, hell, even the doll, were all escaping into the distance. Whatever was going on, it had the entire supernatural ecosystem in disarray. This realization sent me into a panic. I shook the ranger, trying to get him to react, but he just furrowed his brow and focused more on the words in his hands. "It's too late for help. Just get out of there," I heard from down below. He was right. The flames were licking the edges of the tree line, and it wouldn't be long before they caught up to us or we were smoked out. I ran to the door, but as I reached for it, I heard a familiar click. The ranger was still sitting there, book in one hand, derringer in the other. I just raised my hands, knowing that he was serious, and sat back down. I waited anxiously, helpless to do anything except watch the raging inferno creep ever closer. The smell of smoke permeated the room. Every so often, the ranger would glance up from his book to ensure I wasn't going to do something stupid. The night crawled on, and anxiety churned within me. Eventually, a new light began to grow, a brighter hue than the blood orange of the flames. It was the yellow iridescence of the sun. Eventually, the new light overtook the old, and everything went calm. When the shift ended at dawn, my coworker got up and left. I followed suit, anxious to see the results of the damage. To my surprise, there wasn't even a speck of ash. There was no lingering smell of smoke, not even the residue that remained after flames lit wood. It seemed like yet another trick of the woods, designed to get us to come out, and this time, it almost worked. These events are never one-offs. They often happen many times, but always at random. There's no way to predict what you'll encounter on any given night. However, sometimes, things fall out of your control. You can do everything perfectly, but another factor will change the expected outcome. One night, I was on my own. I prepared the shift as best as I could, picking up my fresh book. By this point, I had taken a liking to reading. I understood why it was my partner's preferred pastime. It pulls you away from the drab boredom of the night but keeps you aware enough to react to things happening around you. It also has no technology, so there's no external interference. Don't even get me started on the time I tried to bring in an old TV. I was a few pages in when I had to squint harder to read the fine print. It was dark again, the same oppressive darkness that enveloped us a few months ago. Knowing what to do, I went around snuffing out all the light sources, just for good measure. I even turned off my phone. I sat back down, defeated, knowing my only pastime was gone. I resigned myself to sitting in the oppressive darkness. It's strange seeing the sky so empty, a thick blanket of black covering everything around you. There wasn't even a drop of light pollution from the nearest spot of civilization. Everything was completely blank. This is why it's so easy to spot when something pops up. A tiny fleck of light appeared in the tree line. From the looks of it, a camper had wandered into my zone, and they seemed to be trying to create a source of light, understandably. I could see the swing of their flashlight as they gathered wood for a fire. However, they didn't get very far. The glow rained down from above, a harsh, overbearing pressure beam from the sky. It was almost like a spotlight was focused directly on the camper's exact position, lighting him up like the brightest floodlight. I ducked away, knowing this could only mean trouble, but I kept a vantage point to observe the situation, albeit through a small slit. As I glanced up, I realized that the light wasn't just an illumination source, it was an eye. It was gargantuan in size, staring at the camper. They must have been frozen, still, from sheer terror, judging by the lack of movement from their flashlight. What happened next was the most curious thing. I saw the stars dotting in and out at the edges of my vision. At first, I couldn't figure out what was going on, but before I knew it, the light sucked up the camper faster than I could blink. One moment, he was there, and the next, he was just a dot, zipping through the sky into the eye. The eye also seemed to be a mouth in the center. Suddenly, more stars flickered into view as the edges of the eye rippled away. And as the eye closed, I realized the stars didn't disappear. They were covered. They were covered by this strange, titanic umbrella of a creature, fluttering away like a jellyfish, content with its catch. After a safe period of time, I turned the lights back on and resumed reading. These are only some highlights of the bizarre things I've seen in this job. I haven't even mentioned the mouthless deer, the kidney repairman, and many other strange occurrences. As time passes, I only discover more phenomena, some of which my partner has never even seen. It's trial and error, trying to figure out how to survive each new thing. It's time to make sense of why so many people come and go in this job. Now I know they don't quit like I originally thought. Still, a job's a job, and I'm pretty good at this one. So, I'll keep doing it for as long as I can. For now though, I hope you've enjoyed hearing about some of my strange work experiences. I hope your job is more mundane than mine,